Right. Can everybody hear us now?
Is there sound? Ooh. Yeah, I'll. There we go. If I do this, yeah,
Right.
I can hear us.
Okay.
Hooray!
Okay. I think we're live now. Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. I will get the technology dialed in. So hello, welcome to the fourth in my Transport Tavern. So I'm very, very happy to welcome my good friend and collaborator and many other things, Mr. Gareth Dennis. Hello, Gareth.
Hello, David. Hello, Dr. David Turner. It's an absolute pleasure to finally get onto a Transport Tavern, or rather, get into Transport Tavern. It's a pub, isn't it? Right?
Well, it's a pub,
Um,
yes, and because
yeah,
we're in a pub, of course, we have a drink. So
absolutely.
here's our drinks for the day. Gareth, you're on the old punk IPA, aren't you?
I've got a colossal bottle of Punk IPA here, which you can't see because I'm not on the stream. But there we go. Oh, there we go. Nice. Just a bit of sound effects for everyone there. Oh, lovely.
And I'm drinking Lost and Grounded's "Want to Go to the Sun," which is a pale ale, and which is it's a Bristol brewery, and they're very lovely. And as I've said before, we're trying to support local breweries on this. So well, Punk Brewdog are
I,
not
I,
so much a local, small brewery anymore, but
no, they're not. I don't feel so good about supporting brewery anymore. So Brewdog are my local, are like my original home brewery. They were a micro. They're based in Ellen. Much like Annie Lennox. They're from Ellen, which is just over the hill from Inverurie, where I grew up. And they used to be. I used to not be a fan of Brewdog. Here's my Brewdog. I'll just tap this to show it's real. And I used to not be a fan because they went too extreme to the far side, whilst actually aiming for a mainstream audience. So they kind of annoyed me, and they were like anti-camera and a load of stuff. But actually, now their branding is better. Their branding's better. The beers, Punk IPA is a classic, but I
mhm.
also have an even better Dead Pony Club Session IPA, which I find delicious. Anyway,
Anyway,
so that's my drink.
that's your drink. So Lost and Grounded are in Bristol. They're a lovely brewery, and they make a lovely Hellas lager I'm particularly fond of, and they're just a top brewery. Anyway, so our topic today is continuity and change. And I said to Gareth, well, would you come on? And he was like, yeah, I'll come on. What should we talk about? And we went through a few titles, didn't we, Gareth? We went through
We did. We couldn't decide. In fact, we spent ages talking about titles because actually it was like, how on earth do we capture? Bearing in mind that we had essentially no idea where this conversation is going to go, and I suppose we sort of don't, which is why I've deliberately structured it a bit when I sent you through my pictures. But yeah, I think this summarises it quite nicely: continuity and change.
yeah. I will say I've been having a bit of trouble with the internet today. So if this crashes out at any moment, stay on the line, as it were, and we'll come back to you. So onwards with the show, Gareth. So this is the question I pitched to Gareth as a historian. If you could design a historical research project that could inform current practice, what would it be? So Gareth, over to you.
Yeah. So I've been a bit cheeky in that I actually answer this. I actually don't answer this immediately, and I come back to it at the end and answer it. But I like this question that you asked me because actually I've already done this. I've already designed a historical research project to inform current practice. And if we go to the next slide, I can sort of explain what that is. So my master's thesis was determining the limits for acceptable use of worn rails on UK standard gauge heritage railways,
Of course,
which is a
with
bit of a mouthful. But
yeah.
essentially, this is what started not my personal interest, but my technical interest in the permanent way. And
Mm.
for anyone who's watching or listening who doesn't know what the permanent way is, the permanent way is the railway track, the kind of the fixed railway infrastructure. In the olden days, they would build a railway by having kind of a very rough and ready and reusable set of tracks that they'd lift up and drop down on as they built up the earthworks, or cutting or whatever it happened to be, and that was called the temporary way. They'd then lift that and they'd often reuse it elsewhere as they were continuing to build, and behind it they would lay what was known as the permanent way, which was doing broadly the same thing, except that it was intended to be sat there for several decades. So that's the difference between the temporary way and the permanent way, and we still call it the permanent way, but it refers to the rails, whatever you're holding the rails up with, whether that's sleepers or slab track or whatever, long timbers, ballast underneath, or mass concrete if you're using slab, and then to an extent the formation underneath that as well. So not just the ballast, but also if you've got stuff underneath. So that's the permanent way. And it also includes, all the little fiddly bits we use, so switches and crossings and junctions. And anyway, this project came out of a request from the Office of Rail Regulation. Actually, Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate, Bill Key, and others involved there, wanting to know, there were a load of heritage railways running with very worn old rails, and they wanted to understand what the risk was that one of those rails would fail at the extreme ends of their life. And this is what the question was, and so I did a master's thesis on it.
How likely were they to break? I mean, are you allowed to convey that information?
Yeah. So the conclusion was essentially, for the most part, you're going to be ending up striking the flange of the wheel on fish plates before you reach a point where the rail is going to mostly going to fail. And so the rails don't just, steel doesn't just fail randomly. It fails at stress concentrations, usually, certainly for older rails, usually where you've got like a flaw, like a hydrogen bubble or something. So before 1976, steel that was used in rails was reasonably rubbish. It was fine. It was better than wrought iron, but it had quite a lot of flaws included in it. And so the research looked at the likelihood of those occurring and how big they'd have to be before a failure was. Anyway, we're not here really to talk about the detail of it, but I thought I'd open with describing that was my route in. So that was the project. I'm sure we can talk about that another time.
Well, you say you'll come back round to that later. So
yeah, we'll come back to the question.
And I should say, everybody, if you've got questions along the way, I mean, we've got a question from Matt already. Is that similar to using part-worn tyres?
I suppose you're referring to steel tyres on locomotives. I suppose even vehicle pneumatic tyres on cars. Sort of, yes. I suppose an analogy might be where you, it's just if you're running on a road surface, at what point does that road surface fail when you run on it a lot? I suppose you could use the analogy of worn tyres. Like, at what point is the tyre really going to disintegrate and pop once you've worn through the canvas? Yeah.
So, should we move on to how does history inform present industry practice? I mean, in your work, in the industry, there's lots of path-dependent systems, aren't there? The history is almost present there all the time, isn't it?
It is, and there's no avoiding it. And I suppose I'm going to pick out a few things. I'll start with referring to a couple of things that kind of hark back to my thesis project. But we'll start going through, and actually, a lot of the theme of this is the fact that there is no avoiding history when you work on the railways. There's no, you can't really. It's like trying to separate railways and politics. It's not really a thing. They're totally intertwined.
Yeah,
and it's the same with history, and particularly in my day job. So here we've got a picture of anyone who's on the chat should hopefully a few of you recognise this as star cracking at bolt holes. So where you've got, in the olden days, they would connect rails with two fish plates that would go on. So if you can imagine you're looking top down on a rail, you'd have two fish plates either side and then bolts that would go through to hold it together. The trouble with that is that when you start running lots of traffic, fatigue cracking forms, and you get these star cracks. And the one in the middle there, and indeed the sketch down at the bottom left, is from Hither Green in 1967, which is a major, really catastrophic rail incident. We're not going to talk much. I'm going to try and avoid talking too much about safety in this one, because I think that's probably another chat. But it is worth pointing out that fundamentally, history informs the present industry's practice by us learning from our mistakes.
I suppose sorry, Gareth?
No, go on.
No, but I mean, this is a case, if you think about this, that they've been using those sorts of connections since day one, really, haven't they? And and so you can look at something you find on the railway at any point and think, well, there is history in action. I'm dealing with it. I'm solving history, or I'm fixing history, or
the railway's a dynamic system, and dynamic systems have lots of variables. And in this instance, there were several variables at play. You had more DMUs with smaller wheels running through more frequently, which increased the fatigue loading. So even though perhaps the impacts weren't as much, the frequency of loading had increased, and all sorts of other little variables. And in fact, it was Hither Green in '67, which is what started the rollout of long welded rails.
Yeah.
It was to fix this problem.
Mm.
Anyway, yeah. So that's what practice is informed by that. And so if we go to the next slide. We're kind of on to heritage railers again. So I talk about detail flaws. This is an example of some. So this is vertical longitudinal splitting, which is something that I didn't actually look at in my thesis. I only very briefly touched on it. But this is something that happens in older rails. But in terms of us moving on and learning from history, we have solved that problem in terms of the quality of steel we produce. So you don't get as many detail flaws. So you don't get as many failures like this. And if you pop to the next slide. I say we don't get many. They do happen every now and then. And here's an example of one on a newer rail. It's still a pretty old bit of rail, but it's flat bottom rather than bullhead, you can see. And it's done a bit of a cheese with a freight train going over the top and made a bit of a mess. So there's this constant, I suppose the reason I put these two up is there's this constant flux of old and new and a feedback between us learning and learning from the past, incorporating, understanding how we're changing things, changing variables, more trains, different types of trains, different weights of trains, different behaviors of bogies, all these things, just within the permanent way, let alone in wider railway practice.
I mean, if you take an example like this sort of rare example of something like this happening, of course, the way that has been stopped is working with the supply chain, isn't it? It's through that feedback doesn't just include the railway industry proper. It includes steel producer, British Steel and all those, everybody in the supply chain. So do you think building those relationships is also important in a historic sense?
So it's important not only. So we're bearing in mind a lot of the railways. If we take the very narrow example of rail steel, because it's the railway is very complicated, and sometimes it's good to just look at a very narrow portion to analogize the rest of it. Look at a very narrow example of rail steel. Now, the rails have branding on the side, which gives us the age, the type of steel, where they're manufactured, and a lot of the rails on the network. Like when I say a lot, I mean we're talking about still hundreds of kilometers worth, are still using rails that were created over half a century ago.
Right, okay.
And so you have, their rails until very recently, in fact, there probably still are quite a few up there. The Kavla-Kalsch line still had rails from the 1900s. And what I mean by that is the 1900s.
Right, okay.
So, or the 190Xs, if you like. So we run on some pretty old infrastructure. And if you can imagine, that's also true for things like earthworks, which have the added complexity of being almost totally hidden. Mm-hmm. So you can just imagine all the different systems we're having to understand, signaling systems, all these things. So what I mean by that is you have to have that relationship not just with the current supplier, but that supplier or previous suppliers have to understand what stuff they used to give the railway. And if that supplier dies and that information is lost,
firstly, Mr. Tim Dunn says it's Monday and he has wine. Hello, Tim.
Excellent. Hello, Tim. Lovely to see you.
And Gordon has got Everard's Tiger. Hadn't had that for a while.
Oh, lovely. Everard's Tiger, interesting. I'm glad to see a few people pointing at Hither Green. Yep,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. Sorry, I had a digression. But I mean, that's the importance of, should we say, asset registers and and schematics and plans like the Network Rail Archive is very important. History is underpinning it.
And we lost, horrifyingly, we lost a huge amount of asset data during the demise of British Rail and the rise of Railtrack. A lot of that information was outsourced. Railtrack were kind of incentivized and managerially thought that they were just essentially sort of a management company, and they'd bring in companies who would manage the assets. And unfortunately, all the people they had coming in to manage the assets thought they could save money by not looking after all this asset data, because it's just a railway. What changes about it? Yeah. Obviously, that caused problems. I mean, without going down a long alleyway.
It's perhaps something for another time. But I mean, You do get that sense from that period that so much was lost, not simply in terms of assets, but in sort of ingrained knowledge, informal practices and informal knowledge at that point. And
Absolutely. And the turning point for that, if you flip to the next slide, I'd say kind of a turning point for our asset management was this incident. Now, I know there's a bit of a lag on the chat, so I can't play sort of teacher's quiz, but this is, so what you see here is 35 meters worth of long welded rail that is shattered like ceramic into about 200 pieces. This rail is from Hatfield.
right,
And if we're talking about incidents that are related to the way that traffic and variables change on the network, this is a perfect example where a curve that was pretty innocuous beforehand, we're running trains faster, heavier. We're changing the way that we manage dynamic forces, lateral forces through curves, and as a result, we were putting a lot of fatigue forces in. It was something that was a problem that was understood by British Rail, and in fact was understood even before that by the precursors to British Rail. So it's a very long understood problem, but it had never resulted because frequencies were increasing so much more on the network through this happened in 2000, but frequencies were already increasing greatly. It was not thought that this sort of problem would happen, along with a load of horrible management issues again. But anyway, I put this in just to show that we're still learning, and this for me is one of the most pivotal, from a track perspective, this is one of the most pivotal learning moments from history that we have. And so it's not just ancient history, it's recent history, and we have to learn from it. Anyway, right, so,
next.
And how do we capture that learning? Remembering what slide I put up. So if you pop to the next slide.
Whoa!
Ta-da! These are the standards for managing temperatures in rail to avoid buckling. And it's not these aren't all of the standards either. These are just the main standards in TRK 001 and Handbook 49 and 2102. Just to throw a few standards out there for everyone. For the standards.
It's what they're all here for, Gareth. It's
what they're all here for. Essentially, I only put this up to give an idea of this is how we capture that learning. Yeah. Standards are how we remember that stuff. Yes, we've got, Read for Danger. Yes, we've got all the nice shiny books with photographs in them. Yes, we've got crash reports, which is a phenomenally good reference. Gary Keener's Railways Archive is always worth dipping into if you want to understand particular incidents. But in terms of turning that learning into a tool for design and for management and for maintenance, standards are it.
Yeah, I mean, how is this held now? So in British Rail's days, it would be held in one way, but now is it centrally held in a way, or is it dispersed in some way? I mean, what are the organisational arrangements about where?
So it's maybe I should have put the old standards triangle in. So I'm holding up here actually my old scribbled in copy of Handbook 49, which is the old track if I hold it right up, this is the old track design handbook, but actually a lot of bits have been moved out of this. So there's a hierarchy of standards. The ones that are more legally important are the less detailed ones. So, for example, the European standards, the railway group standards, these are legally binding standards. The Network Rail standards are not legally binding. They are, hello everyone. I'll hold it up again for everyone. So here's that way. Here's a standard. So the Network Rail standards are not in and of themselves legally binding, but they're very detailed. They do form the legal safety case for Network Rail operating the infrastructure. So I wouldn't have a job for very long if I stopped paying attention to these. But in terms of the legal structure standards, these aren't legally binding, whereas the railway group standards that are managed by the RSSB are. Anyway, so they're held centrally. So Network Rail own these. Nexus have their own. So the Tanaway Metro have their standards. All the different tram companies have their own standards.
Are there any sort of international standards like? Is there anything that cross international boundaries? I mean, of course.
So there are some standards that are UIC standards that really do cover the whole globe. But broadly, the highest level we use in the UK is the European standards, the technical specifications for interoperability. And they're a good set of standards. They're being used now across the world as a set of baseline standards of quality to have a railway that will work and will fit together nicely. For example, a new high-speed line in Morocco is being built using the technical specification for interoperability, which is a good reason for us to continue to use the European TSIs in Britain, because if we want to keep ahead of the curve, have our engineers designing and building railways that we can, with skills that we can export, we need to continue using the TSIs.
Do you think if you take a sort of set of standards like this, if you were to sort of go back through the different versions, how far do you think you could take that? Because if we look at something like in the 60s and maybe before, would you be able to create a genealogy, as it were, of elements and?
Yeah. So behind me here is, I'll pick it out. This again, I know I'm in a bottom corner area. He's got skill on the buttons. This is the first edition. I keep doing that. Sorry. This is the first edition of the Permanent Way Institution's British Railway Track. And you can see behind me. I don't know if you can see behind me. I've got every single edition until the present day. I'm very pleased to say. Thank you, Peter Elliston. And it includes probably the most famous version is this one here, the blue and yellow book. And this captures the standards right back to, so the date in here is, I think it's 47. Yeah, so it's 1947. And you can trace the development of the standards. You can see the S&C geometry develop. You can see the approach to managing super elevation can develop. So to answer your question, very much yes. And actually, sorry, go on.
I mean, when my students do like the development of working practices, they look at one of the things that they sometimes touch on, sometimes it comes up, is the sort of similar sort of development of the rule book. The first rule book, the first page, the first Liverpool to Manchester rule book is like a page of notes.
Yeah.
It's like
really?
12 or 13, 14 bullet points. And as things happen, it develops and evolves. So yeah, that's the rail track.
I've got a bit of it. This is only a small part of it. This
Number
is
11.
But this is now held as a railway group standard. It's 8,000, I think. Someone will correct me on that. The rule book's now 8,000.
That's the Great Western Railway rule book from
terrific.
33.
Oh, yeah, so this is... Yeah, so this one is...
33?
Yeah, still in inches.
80. Anyway,
there's that. So that's quite nice, actually, David. You give me an excuse to dig out all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean...
It's great.
I'm very interested in that idea that how these things develop and the points at which they develop is like you get standardization of the rule book in 1876, the first when the Railway Clearinghouse sort of standardizes it. So these sorts of things sort of evolve through. Yeah, it's just fascinating. It's a dynamic process.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a great... Sorry.
And there are surges of learning, and there's sometimes when things stay stationary for a while. So we actually, there was a tremendous period of learning between the late 60s and the mid to late 80s. We went through several mini revolutions, if you like. I've actually written a piece for Railway Gazette International recently about the fact that I think we have the potential to be right on the cusp of another permanent way revolution in terms of development. It's all about data, as you'd expect me to say. Read the piece, I'd go into the detail. But there are lots of mini revolutions, and actually they were related to data as well, because certainly in the 80s, we started using a lot more digital asset management. British Rail pioneered a lot of these digital asset management systems and dynamic modelling systems so that we could model the way that the wheels and the rail, the interface between the wheel and the rail behaved. So the British Rail were a leader in vehicle dynamics modelling for a long time. Yeah, it's good.
Good. We have a question.
Anyway, right.
We have a question for you, Gareth. From Matt? Thank you for the question, Matt. Does a piece/length rail have a life expectancy?
So if I go in here to get out level 2 specification, design and construction of track, I can tell you exactly what the life expectancy is. Please tell me. I think it is in here. It gives me a life expectancy of... So we measure life expectancy in, not necessarily in years, but in annual tonnages. Because if you can imagine you've got a lightly used line, it's the number of times that rail is being flexed by the passenger traffic is less than on the West Coast Main Line, where you've got one of the most heavily used lines in Europe. And so... the design life for sleepers, bearers, base plates and rails in normal service conditions of, for SEN 60, so that's 60 kilograms per metre, the lesser of 1,200 equivalent million gross tonnes per annum, or 60 years for plain line, and 1,000 EMGT, or 60 years for S&C. So they are, so 60 years for plain line, 60 years for S&C, and for SEN 56, which is the old 113A pounds per yard that everyone should be familiar with if you're a railway nerd. It's the same thing, 60 years. So we designed for 60 years, but we're meeting that a lot more rapidly on a lot of the network because we are carrying so many trains. Anyway, there we go. There's your answer. Thanks, Matt. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, Gordon raised a very good point about someone, Bill Bolton on the PWI for the Oxted line, that he knew every inch of the track. The problem is it was all in his head.
Yep.
I've known archivists like that, just to say.
We're going to touch on that later, actually. So it's a very, very good point that Gordon raises. And we'll touch on that corporate memory because I think it's a really important thing to address later on. Good point.
Well, we'll touch on that in a minute. And where does history is found? Ooh. Where is it found in your day-to-day work, Gareth?
Well, I think if we pop to the next slide, I think we've got the kind of the main example.
I have a question for you quickly here.
Oh, yeah, go on.
I went past one, I think it was Stratford Way, a few days ago, on my exercise, of course, and it said 1 mile, but it didn't have the chains. It had yards.
Good. So actually, weirdly, it's on the designers to specify whether this says chains or yards. And so the way this works, actually, there's when you renew a bridge or do some work on a bridge, the civil engineers, the design civil engineers, so the people working for Arcadis or whoever it happens to be, Arcadis being the company I work for, we do there's a drawing with this thing on it, even though it's standardized, and I don't know why we have to do it, but we always do. There's a drawing with it, and actually, I always encourage the civil engineers to not put chains on there and to correct it and not put lowercase m for miles, because lowercase m is the ISO standard unit for meters. And quite often in reports, I'll see within even the same paragraph, the use of lowercase m for meters and lowercase m for miles. And it's a recipe for disaster. So I get angry about this. But the reason I put this up is essentially to talk about history. And the first thing is that we measure our entire railway network. Not just do we use ridiculous archaic units that don't make any sense, i.e. miles, yards, chains. These are useless units. They're very difficult to use. And actually, I only use them at the very end of a design when I'm converting it away for the maintainer to reference something. For the most part, I refer to changes in meters and kilometers. But not only do we use these archaic units, but actually the datums that these refer to are totally arbitrary now because we've chopped bits of railway up, we've rotated, and we've realigned, or we've snipped a bit out, or we've got a diversion. So the whole railway network, before you even get started on changing it, just knowing where you are is based on nearly 200 years of legacy, and in some cases more when you've got railways based on canal alignments and stuff. So I thought it was an interesting one to put up. But for anyone who's interested, who doesn't know, this is a structure number plate, if you like. It's a bit of it's an ID tag for a structure. Generally, we just put these on under bridges and over bridges. So an under bridge is where something goes under the railway, and over bridge is where it goes over the railway. And the top letters refer to the engineer's line reference. So in this case, I think it's Charing Cross to somewhere else, because this, I think, is next to Borough Market. So that might make sense, right?
It does look familiar to me.
Yeah. 45B, the big one, it refers to the structure number. Yeah. So in this case, there's probably structure 45, and it probably has several portals, several spans, of which will be A, B, C. Or maybe there are a few discrete structures and they've added them in and got a bit cluttered, so they've had to add a letter just to distinguish them. And then, of course, the small numbers at the bottom refers to 1 mile and 49 chains. Now, a chain is 22 yards. There are 1,760 yards in a mile. There are 80 chains in a mile.
Am I right in thinking we're not sure where that comes from?
What chains? It's one of these. I've never really investigated it in any great depth. It's probably one of those things that there are a few explanations for it. It's like fathoms, isn't it? It's arbitrary, and frankly, it's not useful, and it's silly that we still use them on the railway. And the sooner that we convert everything to kilometrages, the better. And we are doing that eventually, right. But it's slow. Anyway, sorry. So, where is history found in my day-to-day work? Well, everywhere. So, and I suppose when we bring the next question up, I'll continue to answer this previous question as well. So all sorts of things. And I think, if we go to the next slide and the next question, it kind of helps answer that one as well.
History inspire or inform your practice?
Yeah, so um, if you skip to the next slide,
Okay,
it's a slide of a slide, in
I
fact,
like that.
because
I
this.
saw this when you sent it over and thought that's lovely.
So if you ignore the poor quality of my cuticles, you can see here that this is. I'm sure you'll recognise this as Newark Flat
Mhm.
Crossing, which is a series of sort of. You can see it's a sort of set of switch diamonds, not switch diamonds. Sorry, it's of diamonds. It's a diamond crossing, and this is two tracks, two track railways crossing each other on the same level, which is a catastrophic idea. It's a dreadful idea, and it's a perfect example of a really challenging area to fix. The reason it hasn't been fixed yet is because it's in the too hard pile, and government isn't willing to spend money on railways. But that's another story. And there are so many parts of the railway network that are like this. Curved platforms that are a nightmare for accessibility, and we'll get on that in a minute. Railways that have a horrible alignment, so your trains can't go any faster. Bridges that are so low that it's difficult to electrify. So in terms of inspiring and informing practice, we have to learn from this, and as we go forwards, we need to try and stop preventing ourselves from enabling the railway of the
I
future.
suppose
So if you go to the next,
I suppose
sorry, go
you're
on.
sometimes you're dealing with the time horizons of engineers back in the 19th century, aren't you? If they're
Yeah,
thinking 50 years ahead, that's no good for you. So, curved platforms when you've got a six-wheel carriage is,
yeah,
yeah.
it's fine, and also accessibility is not a thing because disabled people just died in the Victorian era. So, I mean, that's not true. Don't. I realize I'm here with a professional historian. So, but the point is, like, the reality is, we think that everyone should be able to use public transport now. So, platforms is a really good example where that is just a real issue. I've got a slide about that in a minute, actually. So, I won't go off on one about
Yeah.
platforms.
I mean,
But anyway, the reason I put this one up is because it's basically talking about I kind of like this is like on many levels meta. So not only is this a slide of a photograph sat on someone's carpet, because the old photograph has just been taken a picture of, if you notice.
mhm.
Nice little short pile carpet. But also, if you like, it's showing how often we're very constrained. We're trapped within a frame like this. We're trapped within a framework set for us by engineers from 150 years ago.
Yeah.
And sometimes that makes engineering interesting, makes railway engineering interesting, but we need to try and get through. Either we should be spending money to break free of that cage, if you like, and we certainly shouldn't be trapping our future forebears.
And I suppose it's not simply the railway engineering that's the issue. You're also dealing with, if we take the lines out of Liverpool Street or, somewhere like that, not Liverpool Street, forgive me, I was thinking of London Bridge. You're dealing with historic decisions that happened either side the railways as well, because you're
Absolutely.
constrained by the space in which you could work. So it's not just history on the track; it's to the side,
And
above, below, round.
yeah, and it's not just the physical, as you and I like to say. We kind of, both of us, like to bang this drum. It's about the wider context.
Mm,
It's not just, Crayonistas have to think about this. When I'll freely say I am one myself, I like to think about what new railway lines are potentially useful, but we've got to think about political context.
yeah.
You've got to think about the wider social context as to why these decisions are made. It's not just because the engineers didn't have foresight. There were political. The reason this isn't a flyover is because they were economic. They
Mm.
didn't not have flyovers when the Newark Flat Crossing was originally put in. It was an economic choice. They decided they didn't want to build build an intersection bridge.
Yeah.
That was an economic choice at the time.
And I think
We've been trapped by that.
if you deconstruct, where if perhaps the way to think about it is to think of limits, where the limits are and where they're pushing. If you think about something like the Department for Transport, even when a new government comes in, there is a ingrained understanding and ingrained knowledge that comes with that. They're constrained by their history to think in certain ways and present things to the minister, even though the minister might have their own ideas and there's an interaction there. But
Absolutely.
yeah, local councils, local government as well. They are,
Yeah.
they have their executive, the councils, and that. So all these different constraints all over that interact in a sort of fluid, dynamic way to constrain what happens on the railway. So
And it's beholden on engineers either to become really great communicators themselves
mm-hmm.
or to employ good communicators so that we can break down some of those barriers. And that's what I try and do, to be honest. So I spend a lot of time emailing and pestering people in power, MPs, lobby groups, whoever it happens to be, pestering them and bothering them to try, and also being generally a loudmouth on Twitter, because I'm trying to move the dial. I'm trying to pull the dial over. I'm trying to change the way that we talk about railway infrastructure, the way that we talk about public transport infrastructure, because as you say, we're trapped by the thinking of, particularly Treasury. Actually, the DFT has quite a decent throughput of staff. Unfortunately, as it's kind of perhaps one of the treadmill civil service departments. But the Treasury is locked into 300-year-old thinking. They don't see themselves as enablers. They see themselves as sort of harbingers of not spend. They see themselves as managers of wealth rather than of enablers of prosperity and of. So and okay, that's very esoteric, and I get my socialist hat on. But the reality is that just means engineers need to be better at communicating the value beyond just thinking about the narrow. Oh, it's a bit of S&C that goes at 30 miles an hour. Great.
And I will say we'll get onto the Treasury role on Wednesday. When Gareth and I are chatting on a certain controversial subject.
Yes,
but I wonder just to go back to sort of those thinking about institutional constraints. I have I as a historian, I would have thought that where I went as a historian would come with certain influences on me, not the only one, but is there something in, should we say, the training regimes as well? Sort of means not to knock anybody, but how those systems are ingrained and how people are taught as engineers that might constrain them perhaps in later. I don't want to put you up to say.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, definitely. You have to answer that immediately with definitely. If you're part of an institution as aged as civil engineering is, there are prejudices within the way it's taught, the people who teach it. Pale, male, and stale is the triple whammy. Most of the lecturers remain men. They are often white. They have had privileged certainly in the UK, they've had very privileged backgrounds. I was taught in a university that had very little interest in railways, certainly in teaching to undergrads. And from my perspective, that's rubbish, because so many of my colleagues went to work in oil and gas. So even if if we just look through the sphere of having an environmental conscience, of understanding the context of engineering within a while, the idea of engineering as being absolutely integral to the health of the planet was just not taught well.
Yeah,
it was you had maybe there was an outside course you could do on sustainability, but it should have been the lifeblood of it. Engineering is about harnessing the forces of nature for the betterment of humankind.
Fundamentally, it's like everything. It's constructed, to use an academic sort of terminology, it's constructed by society and the things around it, rather than being just. It can't be objective.
Absolutely.
It can be in certain dimensions. It can be precise and it can be, but objective. It's informed by the mores and beliefs of the people who are teaching it as much as it is.
Absolutely. And if you take a look at I don't want to be mean about the Institution of Civil Engineers, but I'm about to be mean about the Institution of Civil Engineers. If you look at the presidents of that organisation over the last, its entire history, okay, it's understandable that they're tufty, grey-haired tufties back in the day, but for the last 30 or even for the last 10 years, you look through the list of pale, male, stale men who've been president of the IC, and it's disappointing how little scope there has been for bringing new ideas into that organisation. And we could deconstruct that we could continue to deconstruct that, but when it comes to understanding history and context, we're not prepared well for that as engineers. We're not prepared well for it.
Yeah. Should we?
Anyway, so if we go into the next slide is a more optimistic one. So the next two slides are a pair. Here is my favorite location. Here's my favorite location on the British Rail network. Possibly, I haven't necessarily decided that, but I think it is, which is on top of that footbridge, directly above the switch toes of the UK's first 125 mile an hour junction. So this is what you see here is two sets of switches and crossings. They're called equal split switches. And you can see that it's basically a big double junction, and this is Colton Junction. This is where the old this is at the north end of the Selby Diversion, and this opened for operation in 1983. And the reason I've got this picture, and if you flip to the next one,
Ooh, sorry, that was very. That was very, very. I'll be more into it. Yeah.
There we are. So here's my picture. So obviously I didn't take the picture. That picture previously was taken by John Turner.
No relation to me.
So copyright, no relation. This picture was taken by me last week, I think on Friday.
Right, okay.
And with my phone. Yeah, it's pretty good, isn't it? It's not a bad little picture from my camera. Good work. That. Anyway, it's the same site. And it's the same layout-ish. Okay, we've updated the S&C geometry ever so slightly, but broadly it's the same thing. And this is an example of where engineers did have foresight. No matter what the structural limitations of what they were surrounded by, the Selby Diversion, for me, the Selby Diversion, there's a thread I've done on it, so you can go and find that. Hashtag Railways Explained Selby Diversion, you'll find it very quickly. It was the first high-speed line built in the UK, and it was the third high-speed line built in Europe. And it was built for 270 kilometers an hour. So 155-ish, something like that. My maths is dreadful. The point being that this is an example of British rail engineers with many constraints at the time. Even more. This is the late 70s, early 80s that this was being designed and built. But they built this in a way that it is future-proofed. This line is fantastically future-proofed. This junction is still doing what it does very well. Huge amount of traffic goes through here, relatively speaking. It's brilliant, and this is an example of that we can learn from the past in understanding why did they do that? How did they manage to, within the parameters that they had, the restricted parameters far more than we have now? How did they manage to come up with such a good future-proofed proposal and design and built? It was built very quickly, impressively quickly. We should be learning from that. So that's why I put these up is a bit of context.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Tim Dunn is pointing out that this is absolute rot. I have it as a matter of record that my real favourite part of the UK rail network is a table at the York Tap on platform 4 in Europe.
Well, Tim, yes, no, I'm probably with you on. I mean, I love them in different ways, and
both of them make me happy. But if you're this one, I can be happy alone. Whereas in the York Tap, you need friends. Although Colton Junction is probably better with friends as well. Actually, I'm probably a bit of a weirdo, just stood on my own on top of Colton Junction. Anyway, let's
probably
move on.
Have a beer
everyone
on the top
enjoys that
of it.
nice picture, Colton Junction.
So let's move on.
Yes.
Interesting.
What do you think this is when you see it? If you kind of ignore the axes labels, what does this look like to you?
Star constellation.
yeah, that's true.
Something you see on Star Trek.
So what this is, I'm just going to tell you what. Let's have a pause and just have a look at the chat, see if anyone's, because we've hammered through it.
I've been keeping an eye. There's Roman Adocrat has got a question for you. What's the lozenge?
Oh, go on.
What's the lozenge of check rails between the switchblades in the first photo? Seems to be too far to the centre to be normal check rails.
Yes. Now, okay. So if you flip back to the picture two photographs ago, 2 slides back, I don't know exactly, and I keep meaning to look it up. Given that, no, that's the other way. No. Spoilers! Don't look at this. Hide your eyes, everyone. There we go. Right. So, so the one before this.
The one. Oh,
that's
fiddlesticks.
There we are. I presume your computer's lagging ever so slightly with them. Right, so in the middle of these 2 tracks, within the forefoot, so between the 2 running edge rails, there's that big metal thing. There's a lot of force going through the track. I don't exactly know what those are. Keep meaning to look it up. I think I might have just belched live on air. I'm ever so sorry. Anyway.
Don't worry, I've done that. We're drinking beer. It's fine.
So sorry. So in the modern layout, which we'll go to the picture in a second, but for now, I think this holds the essentially adds lateral stability to the track form and maintains the track geometry by holding all the sleepers together. So there's a tremendous amount of force being imparted on the switch rails as the trains go through in either direction. Because there's an equal split, you get equal forces in either direction depending on which direction trains are going. And this just maintains that curve geometry at the point where the forces are greatest, i.e. at the switch tips. So if you go to the next slide.
Okay, I'm going to do this with
the old arrow clicker.
Yeah.
There we go. I think, can you see? Yeah, you can see them. So if you look very, very carefully so if you look on the left, sorry, the right hand track on the third sleeper up from the bottom of the slide, you can see on the left hand side of that sleeper, you can see a lateral resistance plate. And in fact, you can see those in a pattern going right the way up alongside the back drive there in the forefoot. So that so the high drive equipment is what powers the switch. But there's a little funny little like bracket attached to the sleepers. Those are doing the same job. There's a lateral resistance plates, and they hold the track in place as trains go through, just to hold that track geometry at the critical point where the switch is. Sorry, that was a really laboured description. But anyway, there we are. Technical description. # Railways Explained. If we go back to
what someone is now calling was something to do with blood.
Oh right, yeah, that's it. So it just looks like it. So they're talking about this picture because, of course, there's a bit of a lag. Lewis Cott is saying that this looks like a blood splatter.
Yeah,
well, I suppose that's a rather unfortunate observation, given that it represents the position of platforms in relation to the rail running edge.
Right.
So on the bottom axis, you have what we call the horizontal platform X offset. So that is the distance from the running edge in plane of rail. And on the y-axis, we have the platform Y offset, which is the height of the platform in plane of rail. So rotated with the two running. So you've got the two rails like this, flat track, nice and easy. But if you've got cant, we actually rotate the plane that we measure the platform position, because if you think about it, trains also rotate. So that's these dimensions. And you can see that they do vaguely. So the green lines are perfect platforms, of which you can see we don't have many. The orange bands are compliant, but are compliant in one dimension, but not both. And the little green box is where platforms are compliant in X and Y. And you can see that we don't have many compliant platforms. In fact, it's a right mess.
Yeah.
The sweet spot is small. And the reason for that is history. It's legacy. It's that we had our platforms, all several thousand of them, 6,000 platforms we have in the UK. They were built by, I don't know, how many railway companies? 100 railway companies? I mean, how many?
So there were 120 companies in that groups, but a lot of them were leased or owned. Oh, sorry, leased or were
leased or individuals.
Sorry.
So some of them were actually built by small companies.
Yeah, there is. It's so complex. It's a web to you got some companies that were built by another company, but it's.
And that complexity is reflected in the diversity of platform position. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that 1 in 5 people in the UK has a disability, and of those, I think half of those people have a mobility or an impairment that potentially impacts on their mobility. So that's a hell of a lot of people. Okay, if you put a purely economic hat on, that's a hell of a lot of revenue you're excluding from the railway if you don't make their life easy. But if you're just going to be a human, that's an awful lot of people you're not letting ride on railways comfortably and easily. I'd strongly recommend going and having a look at some of the experiences of disabled transport users, Transport for All, and there are quite a few really prominent. Tanny Gray Thompson's a great example. She makes a good point of tweeting about how the miserable experiences she has on rail, where you have to book ahead. Can you imagine booking ahead for every train journey, and you have to be on that train? But there's a potential that train will turn up, and they've changed the train, and so you don't actually have a spot that you can put your wheelchair on, or they've forgotten the ramp, or they've not got staff who can use. Just a nightmare. So from my perspective, we need to be getting rid of all those reds, and ideally getting rid of all those oranges, and just having all of our platforms in that little green box. And there's no reason for us not to do this.
And there's a good case for saying that people, they don't go on journeys because this is it's an emotional burden, and I think
it's horrible.
It's horrible, yeah, but when you couple it with perhaps part of the integrated, interlinked transport system, the hassle that is as well.
Yep.
You have to get a bus to a station, then, and it's.
And people deserve to have dignity when they travel around, exactly. And frankly, it's not a very dignified experience for people having to wait on a platform on your own for someone to walk along with the ramp. Well, you just sort of sat there. Everyone's rushing off to get on the tube or whatever in King's Cross, and you just sort of sat on the train waiting for someone to get a ramp out. It's just pathetic. So the advantage of putting the platform in that little green box is that with appropriately specified trains, you can have level boarding. You can design the interface sufficiently that with a little extender ramp that pushes out the train. Merseyrail are way in the lead on this, by the way. They're trialing the new Class 777 trains, and they're by far the best system because they've looked at the whole system. They haven't looked at the infrastructure in isolation or the trains in isolation. They looked at the whole system. A train that fits the platform. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about level boarding, although I'll get off the soapbox. The point is the history, and this is one of the key legacies. And the reason I picked this one out is because, again, I know I said I wouldn't talk about safety, but this is the main risk on the railways to passengers at the moment. To people who are on railways, this is the only risk that isn't improved, that we're not reducing, that we're not controlling. This is actually at best level, if not worse. It's worsening over time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the platform is a key example of, as a permanent way engineer, this is my main risk interface I have to manage, and it's hard work, very fiddly, and it's all because of, and you have to have an understanding of the history as to why the platform is like that.
We have a question from Simon. What is the most non-compliant platform, if you know? These little dots out in the.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So what's quite interesting actually is you can see little clusters. You can see the little clustery patches of. So there's I think possibly. So there's one that is at the roundabout x equals 1,000, y equals 780. That presumably is. We've dropped the Skype there. Sorry, hopefully everyone's still here. That presumably is one old railway company where they haven't fixed. It might even be like the Cumbrian coast, actually, that one, because the Cumbrian coast has quite wide and low platforms. Another one that's interesting is you see there's a roundabout at the 1100 mark, but within the compliant band of X. I think that's Thameslink. I think those are the Thameslink platforms. So up here you can see there's a little cluster of orange. So if your Y value is 1100, they'd be quite good. But they've been built to match the floor level of the Class 700 trains.
Right. Okay.
Which is fine if only the Class 700 trains run and if all platforms are at that level. But the reality is they aren't and they don't. So it's a really bad.
Well, I mean, that would be an interesting study for a historian to take this data and just map on the different companies that.
Yeah. See, there are lots of little clusters. You can see them, and obviously, if you blow up the resolution of this, I bet there are lots of all sorts of little clusters of some of the railway companies, and they've all been mucked around with. We've had that green box there has been the standard position for platforms since the 60s, I think. So it's nothing. We've had a standard platform position for a very long time. It's just that we have a funny habit of not building our platforms to it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, hopefully that's interesting for people. Let's move on. Ooh.
I think we've touched on this a little bit, but
we have. Yeah, I'm just going to whiz.
The industry learn more from greater engagement with history.
So, I'm going to use a little example here of where the industry is, if you like, totally detached from history. So, what you can see here is a picture of Network Rail and its various suppliers all doing a bit of a woo for the fact that they have delivered an S&C renewal, a switch and crossing renewal, so a junction renewal job, and they've handed back, which is the process where it goes from the maintainer back to the asset manager, and basically you can run trains on it again. They've handed back at 125 miles an hour. So in other words, they've not had to apply a temporary speed restriction while all the ballast settles in and while all the track bed's in. They've delivered this renewal in such a way using what we call dynamic track DTS, dynamic track stabilizers, vibrating the track to simulate the passenger traffic to such an extent that trains can run at full line speed, 125 miles an hour through here. And they claimed that it was the first time they'd done it. Nope. British Rail had been doing this since the early 80s on the West Coast Main Line, and then again, I think my dear friends Ian Kitchen and Ken Aston, who are my PWI colleagues, my senior PWI colleagues, former section secretary in the chair, I think they delivered 300 sites at 125 mile an hour handback on the East Coast Main Line through the 80s and early 90s. Forgotten. Completely forgotten. And Network Rail make a big song and dance about it. Now, this doesn't take away from the achievement because we have a different railway. It's very intensively used. So this is great that they're handing back 125. Great. But the idea that this is celebrated, for me, just shows the extent to which corporate memory has been lost in the industry. And this is something quite trivial. Like, it's not actually a big deal that we're celebrating something that we've already done because the implications aren't particularly great. Okay, we've wasted a lot of passenger time in handing back at lower speeds in the past, but actually, this doesn't have a safety implication. But what things do have a safety implication that we have forgotten about? What things do have an operational implication that we've forgotten about? That's quite interesting. So I'm answering that with another question, essentially. But really by asking that question, I'm saying the industry could learn a hell of a lot more by engaging better with history, and in a lot of cases with recent history.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things that Kevin and I sort of exploring on the pacer work is that actually back checks on investment appraisal in British Rail, and I get this from Terry Gervish's book when we were reading up, but the back check there was a back check report for the pacers to see how the investment had gone, see how it had, was the project managed very well. And those were quite rare, and that's the early 90s, so the end of BR. And there seems to be a sort of, if I recall correctly, there was a sort of surprise that this was a rare report. That's that sort of sense that the organisation is looking to the present and to the future, but actually, what can we learn from the past? What goes, what happens before, and that might. I suppose that might come in some part, perhaps from the scale of the organisation, perhaps.
I mean, the railway is massive.
To...
It's unavoidably colossal. If you think in terms of people, the railway industry and its wider supply chain accounts for about 600,000 people.
Yeah.
What is that? What's 600? Is that about 1% of the British population? What's the British population? It's about 70 million,
63, 64, 65 million even. Something like that. So it's not insignificant.
Not insignificant. So that is 100. Doesn't help me.
But I do wonder if you go back and you look from my point of view, looking at the 1920s and 30s, and then even before that, looking at the historical case, I can see very clearly that the railways use history as a PR device and PR function. They use it as a way to sell, but actually sort of looking at projects, and you can't expect sort of before the 39 to have the sort of same level of managerial appraisal and whatever, but they don't really look back. They hold on to understandings about operation from history, but they don't the assessment of what has gone before. I don't feel it comes through very often.
Yeah,
except in marketing, but yeah.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. Isn't it? I just think there's so much. If we'd had a better grasp of a lot of the work that was done by British Rail, this is not me being nationalise the railways and stuff. No, this is just if we'd had the reality is the railways work better, independent of who owns it. The railways work better when everyone is talking to everyone else and everyone's thinking about not just looking forwards, but having one eye on the past and having an awareness of what's gone before. Because the only way you don't just keep retreading the same steps is by knowing what those steps were. And in lots of cases, I'm frustrated by the fact that we forget the steps we've already taken.
Yeah.
So if we pop to the next slide, I think this plays
doing enough to encourage the use of history.
My answer is no. But let's put the next slide up to just cheer everyone up. Let's
get Newcastle Central.
Not only is it Newcastle East Junction, but we have niche forgotten electric railway stuff. So that's always cheers people up. The North East Electrics there on the left-hand side of the photo. And an A4 Pacific. So we've got all the wind stuff. And in fact, I think that's Scotsman as well. And the train is Scotsman. The locomotive isn't.
Yeah, I think it's Flying Scotsman, the train.
Yeah, so we've got all the good stuff there. Also, of course, Newcastle East Junction. If ever I tweet about Newcastle East Junction, it's by far the most popular stuff because everyone.
Well, it's the same with me. I put a photo up and it goes wild. So
yeah, that's because it's awesome, and this is P-Way at its finest. But it isn't P-Way at its finest. This is P-Way at its finest when you want a railway that can do everything all at once with a reasonable level of reliability.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want, but as I often say, when I talk about High Speed 2 and things like this, the main problem with our railway is that it tries to do everything all at once and does none of it well. And this is a really good example of this. The reason why Newcastle East Junction doesn't look like this anymore is because we have segregated services. So, for example, those electric trains on the left of the line are now essentially emulated by or replaced by the Tyne and Wear Metro, by the Nexus system.
Mm-hmm.
So those trains don't need to run there anymore because they're running underground, going over the Queen Elizabeth II bridge. So that gets rid of those. So then you can, ideally, you don't turn the remaining platforms into a car park. You do something better with them. But anyway, that's what happened because
I suppose the part of that is the sort of nature of evolution, and the electric come in, they have to put it somewhere, so they put it on top of what is there before. In some sense, they try. I don't know. I don't know the
It's
engineering history of
you're
this.
right. It's the evolution of the station. But you can see here that the reason this horrendously complex metalwork is here is so that every line, every platform can end up on every line it needs to, pretty much.
Yeah, and RG Travels makes a good point. It's also a period where labour is cheap, so
absolutely, yeah. RG
the
Travels
financial incentive to
labour is cheap, and axle loads are, or rather, sorry, not axle loads, but annual tonnages are much lower.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, the railways ran pretty frequently back in yon day, but nothing to what they're running now. We're running very frequent trains, lots of axles passing, and frankly, if you tried to build this today, it would be horrendously unmaintainable. The only way you'd be able to build it would be if you cast the whole lot in a permanent slab, and the trouble with that is that if one bit breaks, the whole lot has to close. So.
This is the period where you have PW teams looking after
this will have had
track. You'd have between trains, or in quiet periods, you have people going out and tightening the bolts. Oh, is that a bit before? Are we a bit before? Am I thinking of an earlier period?
No. Even this. No, to be honest, even up until the '60s, you had teams that would go out and maintain individual sections. We don't have. When we have TME, the track maintenance engineer does have an area. They do know their area fairly well. It's not the case that we don't have any local knowledge anymore. That's just not true. You speak to the route asset manager. I think the route asset manager I know best is the route asset manager for LNE, whatever that is called now with Network Rail Devo Max. Claire Brint, who's an Earthworks route asset manager, and chatting to her, she just knows. She has such an intimate knowledge of such a colossal, sprawling network of railways. So it's not true that we've lost that, and I think it's quite derogatory to suggest. Some people do suggest, "Oh, we've lost it. We don't know what our railway is doing anymore. It's all totally, discordant labour, and no one knows what's going on." That's not true. But you don't have a shed to the side of this layout with 3 people sat in it permanently with a hot stove and cups of tea. And they literally go out and hammer and screw bolts they know that loosen under each train. We don't have a railway that works like that anymore. And in fact, the reason we developed or invested in mechanical tamping machines that maintain track geometry after the Second World War, you can see a really good example of an early Matisse one in Shildon, is because labour was getting expensive, which is good. Pay people what they deserve to be paid. And labour was short. We just killed a load of our people in 2 world wars. So we had a chronic shortage of skilled people.
Also, the railways weren't paying very well, comparatively.
Yeah, there were better things to do, frankly. And particularly during the 60s, the motorway building craze, if you think about skilled labour, they were more interested in going and getting paid decent navvy wages over on building the M1 or the M6 than they were in maintaining the railways that, of course, at the time were seen as the past. But this is still true today. We have a chronic labour shortage. And so layouts that require lots of intensive labour by specialists isn't a good idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've kind of digressed. I don't even remember what the point was up. I think I was broadly talking about encouraging the use of history, wasn't I? I think we should encourage the use of history because it's useful to explain to engineers why this isn't a thing now, helps them to understand the wider operational context of the work they do. So for me, history is important in contextualizing the engineering we do now.
Yeah. Cool. Shall I move on to the next one, Gareth?
Oh, yeah. Unless, sorry, I feel like I went off on one a bit there, David.
Oh, it's fine. It's all good. So this comes from so hello to any of my students are watching. They're doing um, work identity and the development of professional identity in the 19th century and Edwardian, and then up to 1921. So I thought I'd throw this in because I think there is a sort of I'm always sort of it strikes me about the railway family, but that's a very you look back, and I think Stephanie and Rail said, "Oh, it comes from the 20s to 30s." I think you can, in an editorial recently, but I think you can trace. We don't call it the railway family, but you can trace it back even earlier. That sort of sense of working on the railway, being part of the community, being almost special for working on the railway. Amongst some sections of railway workers, it's not
Yeah.
uniform. It's not, it's interesting in its diversity, and so over to you, Gareth. Have you we got a picture here?
Yeah, I've got two pictures here. So it's a very interesting question. And I think perhaps I'll answer the part about the railway family first, which is an interesting one because I feel very much part of the railway family. But a lot of people in my position, so as a design consultant, a lot of design consultants feel quite distant from the railway. And actually, that accounts for a huge proportion of that, or a decent proportion of that 600,000 strong supply chain for the railways. So the railway family is actually, I don't want to call it a clique because it's not true. Now, a lot of people, including myself, feel really good about that identity. We work on the railway is this wonderful thing that it's a really positive way to, we're moving people around, but also it's a really positive working environment. A lot of people, we're all aiming in the same direction. There's a collective feeling of achieving something and of achieving something good for people, getting them home. But there's, it's an interesting. The railway family is something we could do a whole episode on the railway family because it's fascinating to think about it. But I suppose on the railway family part, I think history has, if anything, history has diluted that railway family. It's by the nature of, and this isn't about nationalisation, privatisation again. By the very nature of the way that the world has developed, take my corner, consultant engineers. We are no longer all. I am a specialist because permanent way doesn't count for other things. Although I do the odd bit of non-railway stuff. For the civil engineers, for my colleagues who are railway civil engineers, in my office at least, 30% of the work they're doing is not anything to do with railways. They're doing work on schools. They're doing work on bits of this and that, all sorts. So that dilutes. So by the very nature of the fact that we have fewer skilled people, so we have to try and spread them about in the civil engineering projects there are. That dilutes the railway family, and that's probably true for other parts of the supply chain as well. So I'm not going to say any more about on the railway family side, but I think it's interesting to think about that. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't encourage the use of the railway family as a term. I think it's good, and in fact, I think it's positive to encourage more people into that. But it's interesting to explore to what extent that resonates with people or doesn't resonate with people.
I mean, it strikes me how you look at those threads that sometimes are problematic in sort of what I was saying earlier about sort of institutional memory, about this is the way we do things, but that is underpinned by a sense of this is how we work together, especially through histories for some people in some points, and also some things like we take ASLEF as a union. It's always been separate from the all grades unions. And that comes from a, shall we say, professional identity that can be traced back. Some of the earliest strikes are amongst engine men and firemen because they felt they had a particularly special professional identity. So you get that underpinning of an idea that comes through, I would say, from the 1840s and 50s and still in place today because we have we have a separate union. So these things, these networks and railway towns as well, the communities and families, and it wasn't just the people who worked in the railway factory, it was the people who worked outside that formed part of this broader community, and there's some really interesting research. So these things I think are really important, these legacy of this long-term history and shaping how people feel, because if you take a place like Crewe, Derby, these railway towns, there's still that sense that, that's an important part of their people's identity. Anyway,
We've both done it. It's fine. People see. I just realised that it's 2011 and we're horribly past time.
That's fine. That's fine.
I don't know. On Rail Natter, it's become a bit of a gag that we always run over. And people have said, "Oh, don't relax about running over. Just say it's an hour and a half." That's not how my brain works. If I say it's an hour and a half, it'll be 2.5 hours before you know it. So it's in my head, it will remain an hour. Anyway,
Okay.
the last thing I'll say about the railway family is I entered the railway family through the Twittery writing side and getting involved in sort of some of the lobbying and involved in that side, not through, and in fact, interacting with yourself and Tim and that's the side that's allowed me to feel part of the railway family. My consultancy, if I'd just been doing consultancy work in isolation, I would never have felt like that. So just as a last thought to contextualize how it feels.
Yeah, and I wonder how that sort of social media element will change it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's very true. The people involved in social media do end up feeling like they're in the railway family. So it's almost like there's a value in encouraging that. Anyway, we could explore that in depth, couldn't we?
There's a whole sociological study there to be done.
Yeah. So the reason I've put so if we keep that picture up, sorry, I've not even finished that. I've not even got to the point of this slide yet. Sorry.
That's all right.
So the reason I've put this picture up is it's about it very much harks to the question: what part does history play in how people establish their professional identity in the industry? Well, on the right-hand side here, we have a picture of what I see as the future of the industry. And what I mean by that is everyone being involved in it. It's as simple as that. The railway works best when the people who shape it are everyone. Yeah. When you have the best representation of people who are involved in that railway. Women, black people, people from ethnic minorities, people from social minorities, people from people who are less well off, age diversity, sexual the whole works. It's the start of Pride Month, a nice Pride flag behind me. If we get everyone involved in the railway, people who are straight, gay, bisexual, transsexual, the whole works, everyone. If we get everyone involved, people from Huddersfield as well as people from Plymouth, people from Ullapool, the whole works. Get everyone involved in the railway will work better for everyone because you'll have a better everyone will feel more representative. The things we do to the railway will represent the people who are using it better. It's as simple as that. So that I don't think anyone disagrees with that, right? Apart from the few old fusty men here and there, no one really disagrees with that point. But a feature I found in railways, and again, this comes a little bit from my HS2 stuff, and I don't want to drag this into a HS2 conversation, but I feel it does represent a problem we have in the railways, particularly in the public-facing railways, and that is your pale male stale one guy who knows better than hundreds of practicing railway engineers or railway practitioners or operations people or train operating people, and it happens a lot in the railways of one outspoken old fart who is convinced that they know best over the experiences of a huge number of younger new engineers into the industry. And the example I've got here is, so on one side, on the right-hand side here, you've got the University of Huddersfield team for the Railway Challenge, which is upsettingly, I don't think it'll happen this year for fairly sensible reasons, of course, but it's a shame it's not happening. But this is the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. They do a fantastic competition where people build a locomotive and compete with them on a little mini track. It's brilliant, and I can only recommend that you go and that you look at the pictures or visit Stapleford Railway, because it's great fun, and they derail as well and make horrible noises. It's just brilliant on every level. It's a great experience, and it's just these teams working together, really diverse team. TfL, Huddersfield, 10 teams compete. It's brilliant. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you have Lord Tony Berkeley, bless him, who has basically got upset about a new railway project and rails against it in a way that makes him seem like he's got all the knowledge and other people don't, despite the fact that they're working in these tremendous, big teams, learning lots. And it's so off-putting to people who want to enter the industry when they see that the people who get listened to, put on the news, who have contrarian opinions, are people like this gentleman here.
Yeah.
Pale male stale. It's hugely off-putting and really upsetting for me. I know I appear on the news and I know that I tick off a lot of the privilege boxes. I think I'm the big five, white, straight, that. I have these. But I like to think at least I offer some new kind of angle, or at least don't offer the same old stuffy person wearing a faded suit and a naff tie.
Yeah.
And it's so important because it's just off-putting to the people we need for the industry to move forwards. So for me, that's about history. That's about that hierarchy. So sorry, I realise I've only just got to the point, David, that's relevant to you.
That's all right.
It's that hierarchy that has existed historically that we need to disintegrate, frankly. That idea that if you're an old man who has all that experience, your opinion is 100 times more important than everyone else's. It's so important that just is destroyed. And actually we listen to everyone's opinion and take it on board. And then if you have that historical understanding and that context, the technical understanding, the operational understanding, then you can judge the opinions on merit, but not just because of the hierarchy. Yeah. That's kind of my point on here. And that's history. And it's really important that we understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. So...
Sorry, I soapboxed there, David.
No, it's fine. No, I completely agree.
Hopefully it's interesting. Hopefully it's from a historical point of view. For example, if your students are listening, hopefully it's an interesting perspective on a problem that exists in the industry as I see it.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very interesting that there's the sort of... I think if you look through, the rail industry has historically been a hierarchical one. The notion of grades and, and breaking that down, getting more voices in is critical, because I would be interested to know how it broke down at, or it changed with privatization. But I think there is that sort of legacy that comes through. So
yeah, it's I'm glad to see lots of people in the chat agreeing, which is nice. So some people are saying, I'm not going to name it. Some people point out, don't you just mean the best people working together? It's not as simple as that, because you've got to understand the privilege that means that the best people end up in that position to make the decisions. You've got to understand that the chances are that they've had a load of you. I'm a perfect example. My parents weren't particularly well off, but they were well off enough that they could spend time with me, which meant that I've got a load of privilege because they spent time with me and I got interested in the outdoors. They weren't working every waking hour to earn enough to put food on the table. So for that narrow example of parental income, I was privileged enough to be outdoors and understanding the outdoors and understanding the world and finding joy in the world. Not everyone has that privilege because their parents are desperately working through no fault of their own. They're working like every waking hour to put food on the table to feed their family. You've got to understand that privilege.
Yeah,
and so it's not just as simple as, isn't it about the best people working on it? You've got to step back from that and think, why are those people in that position?
These structural things are crucially important, and it's easy to ignore them if you're not looking for them at times for some people. And I think you see it. It's very interesting. I mean, that idea where, we've had it recently, all these pictures of people who are on tube trains and they're crowding. And it's just like, well, if you're working in the sort of less wealthy parts of London and you need to go to work, whereas they're what focus is on, but of course, it's stations where, people can work from home. So they're going to be disadvantaged by those factors around them. And it's limiting in it's, what I mean. But
it's basically, you've got to check your privilege.
Yeah,
think about the opportunities that you had that other people haven't. And even if you feel like you've had a hard time, certainly for me as a my parents were not well off, but I've had so much privilege through life. I've got where I am through a lot of privilege, and you have to understand that. You have to think about it, and it doesn't mean that I should just go away and not do anything. No, you just have to let other voices come through.
Yeah.
Realize when you need to step back and let other voices come through. It's really important, and hopefully I get that right. I'm not saying I do, and I'm always learning on that front. I'm always learning, and you just have to keep your ears open. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that was an interesting observation. But it's history. I suppose the whole point of this is a history chat, really. The whole point of that is that this is all about history. This is fundamentally the reason that we have these injustices is history. So a better understanding of that history helps us to allow new voices that perhaps previously haven't been listened to come forwards.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Next slide. Next question. And I think... Here we go. Look at this. We've got 9 minutes left if we're going to hit an hour and a half, and get you out for your dinner. Hopefully we'll beat that. So we've come back to the first question you asked me, which was a brilliant question. Actually, it's a very interesting one. And my answer, hopefully, is I like to think it's quite a neat one. I hope.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's one that that is satisfactory for everyone here enjoying a drink in the Transport Tavern, which is that if I was going to design a historical research project, it would be for us to look at all previous projects as far back as we have useful information, and within the industry we call this a lessons learned. But basically, lessons learned is usually just a Word document that a few people write in and it gets forgotten about and it's a tick box. No. What if I was going to do a historical thesis and really get some heavy money behind it and really get people involved? It would be to look at all past projects and learn everything we could about every single one. Understand what went wrong and what went right,
Hmm.
and so and from that create some form of record to inform future projects.
Yeah.
And so I've put 4 projects up here, ones that are kind of projects that I talk about reasonably frequently. Anyone who knows me would know that I obsess over the Selby diversion, and that is picture number 1 in the top corner with a lovely in City 125, forgive me, with weird black and white tops numbers on the front. Never mind about that. Lovely bit of track there. Look at that, it's dead straight. That's the Selby diversion, and that was a phenomenally successful project on a number of levels. Really brilliant, and there's so much we could learn about that. Little things like, rather than lengthy legal discussions about who gets what bit of land, there was the land permits team basically said, look, we're cutting through the railway. Why don't you just balance the bit of land that was yours, give to the farmer on the other side, the bit of land on the other side that was theirs, you take that, and then that means we don't have to build a bridge that connects them, and we don't have to go through lengthy legal processes because you just get a bit of extra farm to yourself, and you don't actually lose or gain anything. Fine. I've seen no evidence that that's happened on HS2, for example, high speed 2.
Right.
Little things like that, and there are a plethora of them. But the Selby diversion was designed and built in incredibly quick time, and the legal there's stuff we could learn from the legal process as well. Right, I've nattered. Next one.
So
The next
yeah,
one.
what?
So number 2. So the top right hand picture is a picture that was taken by Kate from LNER. Actually,
Yes.
what's her role? Is she comms or is she? She's a big boss. She's the top boss welder at LNER anyway. She's like almost everyone except David Horn reports to her. Hi Kate, if you watch this. This is a picture she took of the Warrington dive under. So this is a pretty impressive bit of work going on, a grade separation project just north of Peterborough to split out the separation of the East Coast Main Line and the GNGE lines. Huge project, about, what is it, 190 million. A lot of good stuff has happened there. I think, as far as I can tell, it's been a very well-managed project. Lots of stuff has gone right. It's been a success.
Cool.
We need to learn from that. We need to record what went well and Blinking Well capture that and keep it and do that again.
And on the bottom,
on the bottom left, we have Crossrail. This is a picture I took actually inside Canary Wharf Station. It doesn't look like that anymore. That was taken about 3 or 4 years ago, I think now. And you can really nicely see the vertical curve off the flat grade of the platform. You can see the vertical curve and then the grade downwards to weave underneath Silverton. So that's quite a cool picture, if I do say so myself. But anyway, Crossrail, as we all know, was brilliant right up until the point that it wasn't. What went wrong? We need to learn that. What went right? We need to capture that. We need to not forget the stuff that was a success, but we also need to understand what went wrong.
Am I right in thinking that sort of there's a community of boring engineers that transferred from one boring project to the other, say Channel Tunnel across to.
It just as happened in the olden days. So in fact, when the Forth Bridge was built, the navvies and the engineers and the technicians and the labourers. Labourers is an unfair name. The people who built things like the Suez Canal and sort of the Aswan Dam and the Forth Bridge, they weren't labourers. Even if they were the lower paid people, they were not labourers. They were incredibly skilled people, generally men, of course, at the time. Yeah. Very skilled people. And actually, just even back then, they transferred internationally. These were international teams. We think of this as being the idea of international teams as a new concept. Even in the 1890s. Major capital civil engineering projects were built by international teams of navvies from across the globe.
No, I think that
the Suez were built by these international teams.
Yeah, I think part of that is that you've got international contractors like Thomas Brassey are taking workers around the world. You know, he built a third of the railways by the 1860s across the world.
So Crossrail, yeah, the team who buried under Crossrail. Interestingly, a lot of them, a decent number of them are Irish, weirdly enough, which is like, harking right back to British Navy history. They're transferring to other tunneling projects, like, for example, the Thames Tideway project, or they're transferring onto High Speed 2, which is the last picture we've got in the corner here. We've got Curzon Street Station in Birmingham. Is going to be a stunning new terminus for the city. High Speed 2 has succeeded on lots of fronts. It's from an engineering perspective, it's going to be the best. It will be the most advanced conventional conventional steel and steel railway in the world when it opens, theoretically. Others might beat it too, but certainly it's a lot of good stuff. But a good example of a total catastrophic failure is their approach in comms and marketing. The way they've communicated the project has been a dismal failure, and it's the source of a lot of the opposition, is because people just don't understand the project.
Yeah.
Everyone decided we don't need to communicate the detail of the project. If we just say the words rebalancing the economy, that's great. Everyone wants to rebalance the economy, don't they? When in actual fact, the phrase rebalancing the economy, the phrase rebalancing the economy means nothing to anyone.
Yeah.
They didn't bother to explain the actual fact that HS2 means more commuting services, more local services, more freight on the existing network. They didn't bother to explain
I think there's an interesting paper I read about 6 months to a year ago that looked at the comms from an early stage, and it took its cue from the business case, which is not really, the sort of speed has been a sort of paradigm of thinking in a lot of these things, and that came through. We'll get you to Birmingham much quicker, and rebalance. It took the wrong messages away, and because those are the ones that were being touted around in government. I think
exactly. It's the fact that unfortunately the cost appraisal process, web tags, so the transport appraisal guidelines. Yeah. They're developed based on journey times. That's where you get your pound signs, and unfortunately, that's then what was communicated to the SPADs, and in turn, that was then communicated to MPs and to ministers, and that's then what's communicated outwards, because you don't want to say a different thing to the public that you're saying to MPs.
Yeah.
So it was unfortunate. There are reasons for it. You can't just blame one. It's a structural problem as much as it's a problem of individual PR companies. But it doesn't take much effort to reverse that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, next slide.
Next slide.
Before I say too much more about that.
So we're on our.
We're there.
We're there. We have reached the end of the journey. So
thanks for letting me join you in the Transport Tavern. It's been brilliant.
Yeah. So on Gareth, thank you so much. Very interesting. Hopefully, I will be as engaged on Wednesday when we are again meeting up for more interesting things, and we're going to be talking about beaching. We'll see how that goes, eh?
Yeah, I think it's going to be good fun. I've got a few. Let's just say it's going to be a different angle on beaching than perhaps people. I mean, if you know me, you'll know. If for everyone who's on here, who's my Patreon supporters and watch me on Rail Natter, you'll know that I'm a bit contrarian. Or I like to uncover the perhaps less mainstream approach. That's hopefully what we're going to do with beaching.
Yeah, so we'll be thinking. I'm going to be sort of thinking about him in context, and so for everybody watching, it should be good, and we should. I hope you'll enjoy it. So tune in then. Yeah. So what's coming up on our next show? Well,
let's see.
So my colleague and friend, Mr. Mike Espester, will be talking about his project, the Railway Work Life and Death Project. That's next week on Monday, and this is a project to catalogue, detail, log accidents to railway workers. I think he's done the awarding period, but he's doing the period after. So if you want, there will be. I have a coffee page if you want to donate. And
do this, everyone. Do this. Support David. Let him do more of these.
And the MA is still recruiting, so it's 3 years part-time, all online. So that's the end. So thank you everybody for coming along. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Gareth and we'll see you next time on the tavern. Cheers, everybody.
Cheerio.
Bye.